Good evening. Welcome to a panel discussion. We cannot walk alone. And Allyship. I am Janet Forbes and will serve as your moderator. This live broadcast is sponsored by the Center for Spiritual Engagement of the St. Luke's United Methodist Church in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. The center looks at the world through a wide lens, building relationships, fostering healing, expanding connection. These guest leaders tonight in anti-racism will coach us to act with more solidarity, teaching us to live increasingly honorable forms of allyship. We cannot walk alone from Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech is our call to action. We need each other in this fight to dismantle racism. The panel discussion will unfold in 3 movements about leadership, vision, and coaching in 3 questions. And between these movements, we will hear from you, our participants, in moments of engagement and question and answer. This is a live, interactive event, multi-streaming on both YouTube and Facebook. I invite you to find the comments section and share your thoughts, reactions, and questions. Be in conversation with each other and with our guests. Our panelists will respond to every question either during the broadcast or in the week ahead. The broadcast will be available to you in replay, and you may leave additional questions in the replay for another week. Now, we have a large gathered cyber community tonight for our conversation, and we will continue to welcome new participants throughout the broadcast. So, to warm us up, I want to know who is connecting from the greatest distance. Whose cyber presence tonight is bouncing off the most satellites? Can you let me know that? I want to send a greeting to John and Linda in Atlanta. You have been dear friends and coaches to the St. Luke's community, and we miss you. I would like to welcome our panelists. It is my joy to shine a light on the leadership and teaching of these who have joined us. Jordan Lee, who grew up in the St. Luke's congregation, a student at the University of Colorado in Boulder studying linguistics and geography. She helps to run a social media campaign called Unmask the Racism, which is working to raise awareness about anti-Asian American xenophobia and racism, which has spiked nationally during the COVID pandemic. She is also working in an environmental studies lab centered on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. She serves as both a member and student staff in the President's Leadership class. Jordan is on the leading edge of Generation Z, our first fully digital natives for whom diversity is the norm. Jordan says, "When I'm still parsing out what leadership actually means to me, I believe that transparency, authenticity, and accountability help us to be more receptive and create an environment for change." Now, her favorite quote to live by is from Stephen Sondheim's musical, Into the Woods. Children will look to you for which way to turn to learn what to be. Careful before you say, listen to me. Children will listen. Welcome, Jordan.
Hi, it's so nice to be here tonight.
Wonderful, my friend. Ken Brown, a visionary leader in large church settings for nearly 3 decades, Reverend Ken is senior pastor of the landmark Trinity United Methodist Church in downtown Denver. Earning his ministry degree from Duke University, he has served previously in congregations in North Carolina, Florida, and Broomfield, Colorado. Ken has been an advisor to nonprofits Hope House, A Precious Child, and CASA of Adams and Broomfield counties. He serves on the board of directors of Take Note, Colorado, and the Allyship School of Theology. Nationally regarded as a small group ministry expert, Ken innovates and publishes in discipleship studies. After the murder of George Floyd, Ken took his leadership from the pulpit to the front lines of the protests in Denver. In a Denver 7 News report, he said, God is at the center of this movement. At its core, this is a spiritual moment. In a recent sermon, Ken spoke of the courage that it takes to move into a risky area. He said, there are places where you will go that are not safe, but they are brave. So go forward into the space that is brave for you. Welcome, Ken.
It's great to be here tonight. Thank you, Janet.
Welcome, friend. Garlinda Burton, a 5th-generation United Methodist Christian. Deaconess Garlinda Burton is the interim general secretary, the CEO, of the General Commission on Religion and Race of the United Methodist Church. She holds degrees from the University of Tennessee and Northwestern University. For 21 years, she served as an author, journalist, and editor with United Methodist Communications, publishing our most beloved and iconic magazines. She then served as CEO of the General Commission on the Status and Role of Women, working to confront and dismantle institutional sexism globally. She became the founding executive director of the Nashville Freedom School Partnership for Underserved Children of Color. And she also launched her own consultancy, MotherWit, to help organizations achieve justice and inclusion. She's a member of the Board of Visitors of the Vanderbilt Divinity School and serves on the Campus Wesley Foundation at Tennessee State University in Nashville. I am deeply appreciative of her commentary following the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, when she echoed Martin Luther King's question, what is the content of our character? And she wrote, too many of us stammer, flounder, and wring our hands, demonstrating such a lack of courageous character in the face of hate. The time has come for God's church to move beyond slogans, book clubs, indifference, arrogance, guilt, and fear. Thank you, Garlinda, for living so faithfully the vocation of a deaconess. Ministries of love, justice, and service. Welcome. Welcome, my friend. If you are just joining us, this is We Cannot Walk Alone, a panel discussion in anti-racism and allyship. Again, please leave your thoughts and reactions and questions in the comments section. And so before I turn to the panelists with our first inquiry, a leadership question, let me define a few terms. Systemic racism is racialized prejudice or discrimination, which is valued, sustained, and protected by institutional power. Sometimes I say prejudice plus power. Anti-racism work is the interruption and or dismantling of racism. Allyship is any practice or activity that delegitimizes, disinvests from, and attempts to end harm to racialized persons. And so, dear ones who have come to lead and teach tonight, I'm going to ask you this leadership question. Tell us about your leadership in anti-racism work and the allies that you esteem. Ken, will you begin?
Thank you, Janet. I'm glad you're beginning this night with a quote from Dr. King's most iconic speech, the I Have a Dream speech. For most people, we don't realize that's not the title of the speech. The speech is Normalcy, Never Again. We know it as the I Have a Dream speech. And when you think about the original title, Normalcy, Never Again, there's no better slogan for 2021 than that title. So for us, this work of being involved in anti-racism truly began at Trinity back in 2018. Like many Methodist churches around the globe, we were trying to figure out how to be more hospitable and less discriminatory towards people based on their human sexuality. So for the better part of a year, the church engaged in a conversation on inclusion. And we realized that as a church, we had some work to do, not only in including people based on human sexuality, but we need to include people based on racial lines, class, able-bodyism. We needed to think about people's appearance, life experience, ethnicity, marital status. And so as we were doing this work on how to be an inclusive church, we landed on a statement of inclusion that you can actually find on our website, so I'll encourage you to look at it. But it had this driving sentence that really was the door that led us into this work of anti-racism. There's a sentence in the statement that says this: as we strive for a deeper understanding of the sacred worth of each person and the holy nature of Christian community, we endeavor to turn our words into deliberate policies, practices, and natural acts of kindness. Policies, practices, and natural acts of kindness. So as we were focused on this work, we realized with the murder of George Floyd, we had to do something. We had to make a stance and create a statement. So with his murder, we invited people in our faith community to join us at protest rallies. And it was at these protest rallies, our community was immersed into the work of anti-racism as we studied, we learned, and grew in our understanding of policies and procedures. And as we were doing this work, something emerged. Incredibly victorious, triumphant allies. And as I think about what allyship means, it really means to come alongside a marginalized group if you are a non-marginalized person and you journey with that person. So two people that stand out, and I'll change their names to protect the innocent. One is Sally. Sally, she befriended African Americans within our faith community that she did not know prior to George Floyd's murder. And in getting to know people, she had social distance lunches, coffees, hikes, in order just to know people, just being a friend, not just a Facebook friend, but in-person friend. And to this day, she is one of the most authentic friends of people because she can see them. And this work of anti-racism helped. The other hero that comes to mind, I'll call him Tommy. Tommy was skeptical about attending one of the marches. So he calls me the night before and said, "Hey, Ken, I've got a confession. I'm concerned about my life. I may get shot. I may get killed." And I said to Tommy, "Thanks for sharing. And the truth is, Tommy, you may." Well, that ended that call the night before the march. And the very next day, not only did Tommy come to join us to go to a march, but his wife was with them along with his children. Allyship is about bodily engagement, making a choice to risk something very valuable, including your life, for the call and cry for others. And again, for us at Trinity, this is how we ended up in this amazing work, and we're honored tonight to continue learning and growing with you.
Thank you, Ken. I love that. Friendships that can see and allies that walk alongside and take those brave steps. Thank you. Jordan, I'm going to turn to you. Tell us about your leadership in anti-racism work and the allies that you esteem.
Yes, so my, I think, main focus of anti-racism began this spring. I know attacks against Asian Americans in the United States has risen a lot recently, but it started in, I think, as early as January of 2020, and continued to rise then. And I was speaking with a friend who is in President's Leadership class, which is a group at CU that I am a part of. And she and I were just talking, and we were like, we have to do something about this. And we didn't really know what to do. And so we were sort of talking to other people in our networks and realizing that one of the main ways that the Asian American community has been affected in the United States, other than COVID directly, has been through decreased business traffic and then xenophobia and racism, leading to decreased people not going to Asian businesses in particular. And so that was kind of where we got this idea started of starting something on social media, part of that because of COVID. And so that made it an easier way for us to engage and to kind of gain a critical mass of followers to try to promote local businesses that we know and create ways and try to help people understand the ways in which they can take action. And then from there, it stemmed, I think, more into just trying to create a dialogue and sharing information about anti-Asian racism in the United States. It has a long history that began in the 1800s, and so we try to kind of take a historical lens in understanding what's going on today. And in doing so, try to help people be more reflective on sort of the stereotypes that they hold and that they hold in their communities. And I think even within the Asian American community that there's prejudices, this is very generalizing, but that we have against other communities. There's a lot of anti-Blackness in Asian discourse sometimes. And so kind of working not only to address the fight for ourselves, but also making sure that we're also being effective allies in other ways. And so through our work, some of the people that have been most impactful are other CU groups. And so that has been kind of a form of coalition building for us, is reaching out in our personal networks with other campus groups that we're a part of to collaborate on different projects and events. So that's kind of a way for, I think, in terms of allyship, just helping to spread the message. Our campaign is very based in social media and gaining like a critical mass of people who are involved in what we're involved with. So some groups specifically, or President's Leadership class, we were able to send information through the alumni network. The Society of Asian Scientists and Engineers was another group that we've been partnering with and kind of having conversations with. And then other CU organizations like the Bold Center have been helping to spread our message. And kind of the other place where we have experienced some really positive allyship from are other Asian American and Pacific Islander organizations who've been working in similar spaces. All of us at Unmask the Racism are pretty new to kind of the activist space, and then working in trying to create more actionable items, I think there was a lot of guesswork towards the beginning. And so we were able to connect with Walks for Washington, which is a pretty similar group that focuses on sort of fundraising money to help support local Asian restaurants in the Washington area. So we were able to kind of get some of their resources and some of their tips and feedback on putting together some of the more logistical aspects of the events. And then we more recently have been in touch with the Denver Asian American Pacific Islander Commission to kind of hear about other Asian American and Pacific Islander communities that we can connect with and try to help expand our reach more. And so I think in to kind of like the big takeaway from this is that our allies have been supportive of the work that we're doing and also in offering resources and knowledge that they have, since we are definitely grassroots in the aspect that we don't kind of come with like the broader, like the backing of like an institution or anything like that. So it's been really helpful to get kind of inspiration and resources and support from everybody.
I love that you say you're an activist in training, but that training is bearing fruit. I love the
Yes.
coalition building as well. Garlinda, tell us about your leadership.
Thanks. I want to say I'll echo what you said, Jen, and I'm just wowed by Jordan. So I'm just excited to hear more from you, Jordan. Um, well, I began working for the United Methodist Church about 40 years ago. And before that, my parents were the first African Americans in some of the jobs that they had. My dad was a compliance officer for the Department of Labor in North Carolina. My mother was the first Black registered nurse in her county in North Carolina. So they taught us at an early age about striving for excellence on the one hand and understanding how racism works on the other hand. And they had friends, they had very few white friends, but the friends that they had were friends, but not allies. They had friends that would walk with them only so far. And they got rewarded for not being offensive, not being too black, and so I watched that dance with my parents, and that was the time that they lived in. They were grew up during the depression, and so I watched that. But as I began to work for the United Methodist Church, things were changing in the country and in the world, and so I got um to encounter a more authenticity and to exercise. I had the privilege of exercising more authenticity. I was in a workplace where I was also one of even though it was later, I was one of the first African Americans in a leadership position at United Methodist Communications, at the United Methodist Reporter in Dallas, and as well. And I began to find my own voice about speaking out, not just what I experienced, but what I saw in the way we wrote, in the way we thought about the church. And I'm talking about the agencies, in who was considered a leader and a spokesperson, who was considered every Christian and every United Methodist, and those of us who were other. Um, and I had lots of wonderful white colleagues and friends, but not many allies. But there was one woman who is retired now from United Methodist Communications, and I'll call her name. I won't say her last name, but her name is Shirley. And Shirley was the one that when we were at staff meeting or planning anything and something out of line happened with regard to race, it wasn't always a person of color who had to raise that issue. She was the white woman, not the white savior, but she was the woman who said, "This is what I see." and we're not availing ourselves of the talent in the room and the voices in the room who may do church differently, who may experience church differently, who may see the faith through a different lens. And Shirley was a real ally. She wasn't afraid of being dismissed as being angry or radical or to this or to that. She spoke her truth honestly, and she did it when no one was watching. So there were times that I heard about later where she, there were no people of color in the room, and she still spoke to those concerns. And so I realized that one could be a friend and an ally, that there did not have to be a boundary to the friendship with regard to how far a colleague and friend would go for you. And so that became really a role model for me. I wanted to be a part of a Christian movement. I wanted to be a part of a Jesus people where we would go there for one another and with one another. And so as I began to grow in my work and get more exposure to Latinx people, to Asian American people, to Native Pacific Islander, Middle East people, then I was encouraged um, to become that kind of partner as well, to learn more about the intersections of racism and xenophobia and national bias and language bias, and so that's what grew in me. And I was nurtured also by United Methodist Women. Let me give a shout out to my people. United Methodist Women were talking about apartheid and racism before the media caught on, before it was cool. I remember I was a kid when my mother did a mission study on China and women in China. And I'm this little kid from North Carolina, little black kid from North Carolina who is learning about, women in the three self movement in China. And so that also heightened my interest and awareness in not only how we're all alike under God, because a lot of us default to that when we don't want to talk about racism, but how God has made us all distinct and different, and how those differences should be celebrated, and how racism dismisses or declaims those kinds of wonderful differences. So, I have experienced many allies now. I've aligned myself with people of all races who are about building one another up and
Mm.
dismantling systems of oppression. And so I now try to look. I am focused on racism most of the time because that's my work. But I also like to think that I am learning and am becoming an ally on issues of gender and sexual identity and orientation, on issues of class, which I think is a big issue in the United Methodist Church, and colorism, which crosses over many of our communities. There's colorism crosses over. So, I'm thanks to Shirley, my first ally, who really spoke out for me. She taught me how to speak out for others and for myself and with others.
Thank you, Garlinda. I love Shirley's voice, and I can hear that. Building up, interrupting, dismantling in a quiet way. Thank you, Shirley, and for that witness. I'd like to move to an engagement break. Do we have some comments and from our participants?
We do, and encourage people to comment.
Let's encourage people to go to the comments section and respond with your thoughts, your reactions, and your questions. We want to look at a few of your comments and then move to a participant question. Good, here we go. Here's Sally. She says, what does it communicate to you when someone remains quiet regarding racial discrimination and issues of race? What does it communicate to you when someone remains quiet? Ken, I'm going to start with you since Garlinda talked about Shirley and her nature.
Well, thank you for that comment. And I think that's a common question that people from a non-marginalized community may have? How are they being interpreted? And I think it's important to note, and I've heard this and you've heard it quite a bit the past year, that at some level, our silence produces and creates a space for violence.
Mm,
And so I don't like to
mm,
overthink this, but I want people to understand when you make a choice to be silent, when you make a choice not to use your voice, someone's at risk. And I know it's always difficult and you have some discomfort wanting to speak up or say something. But the truth is, as we grow in our understanding of seeing people, we have to find our voice and we have to ask the question, how can I speak up? How can I be heard? And similar to the person that inspired Garlinda, how can you create this space for someone else to hear your voice and be inspired by your action? So, my encouragement is to have self awareness around why you're quiet
Mhm.
and sit with that and ask
Mhm.
God, higher power, the universe to maybe give you some insights on how to speak and find the courage to speak, especially if there's something within you, a nudge by the spirit that is saying, this is the moment when you can say something.
Oh, I love that. Listening to the nudgings of spirit and profound. That's when there is silence, someone is at risk.
Mhm.
Jordan, do you have any thoughts about what it means? What does it communicate to you when there is silence in the face of racism?
Silence, I this is something that I have been thinking a lot about recently, and I agree, Ken, that silence creates space for violence. And I think that's a kind of a good way to remember that. Um, and I think it can communicate a few different things. I think one is that there's a discomfort in confronting racism and talking about it. And so there can be a lack of awareness of how exactly to proceed. I think oftentimes when people do try to break the silence, they come at it from a place of anger. And I think that that is also not necessarily the most productive or the safest way to address racism when it comes up. And so um, I think for me, the silence can be really difficult when it happens, but it's important to have kind of an action plan in mind and to think about like what you will do in a situation if you encounter racism. And this could be something that happens out on the street with a stranger you don't know, and it could even happen, somewhere as close to heart as home. And I think that kind of knowing, having some phrases to say, right? Learning how to interrogate that and asking people, oh, why did you say that? Or I don't understand that joke. Why do you think it's funny? That there's ways to break that silence without, I think, coming at it, full force with all of these facts at hand. It's just kind of about trying to like breach that conversation and pull someone into a conversation rather than necessarily trying to call them out. And I think that that can sometimes be a more comfortable way for people to break the silence. And also sometimes a way I think that draws more on a place of compassion and empathy rather than jumping to like anger and blame. Um,
Oh, nicely said. So you're inviting some skill building to actually have the words, to practice the words. Garlinda, um, you currently work for Religion and Race, and that's a part of the ministry that you share broadly. Can you say something about the trainings that you offer in
Well, first,
in skill building for breaking silence?
sure. I think Ken and Jordan have handled some things very well, but not but, and we offer training in our anti racism 101 and our advanced
Yeah.
courses. We do offer some actual role playing to build skill. So it would be, what do you say when someone says, I don't see color? And and tries to shut you down with that, I don't see color. Or what if what to say if someone says, I don't have privilege, I worked for everything I had, or what to say is, if y'all would just get over it, we could move on. And those are all things that are actually said in United Methodist context. So we're not making this stuff up, but we do have practices for people on how to interrupt words and actions that are racist. We've also done some work in, not a lot, but we have created some one-page helps for people on even how to intervene safely when you see someone being attacked racially, either verbally or with violence in a public space. So that I think Jordan is so right, and Ken too, that the being prepared is a way to deal with the silence. And I do know that different kinds of people process information and situations differently. And so I give a little grace for our different ways of responding. I think on my feet really fast, but a lot of people don't, and I understand that. And sometimes I jump, before, without thinking. You know but I think that skill building is very important, and it comes from deciding that, one, I'm going to work on anti-racism. So just like, I'm gonna become a better biblical scholar, I'm going to become a stronger singer in the choir. You have to exercise regularly and be prepared and learn to
Wonderful.
see.
I want to highlight that that's the General Commission on Religion and Race, gcor.org, for all of that information. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to our second movement, our second question. If you are just joining us in this broadcast, this is We Cannot Walk Alone, Anti-Racism and Allyship. And again, please add your thoughts and comments and reactions in the comment section. We have mentioned that moment in the murder of George Floyd and the resulting protests to the recent insurrection at the Capitol, all viewed from within the isolation of a pandemic. It has fueled an inflection point, a tipping point, a desire to ride that arc of justice, to not lose the momentum to which so many, both past and present, have given their lives. And I both hear and feel that deep need that people have to move from words to actions. So I'm asking a vision question. If we were to become anti-racist allies today, how would the rest of the world know? What would have changed? So I'm going to turn to Garlinda because this is a question she likes to play with in her trainings. A kind of vision and imagine what would the world look like and how would it know that we were suddenly allies?
Well, I usually just ask the question. I don't have to answer. But I'll give it a try. One thing that I think would happen, and you can't tell anybody that we're anti-racist. They just have to be able to look at us and know. I think one of the sad things in our denomination is um, our our we're losing members in the United States and losing vitality in many places. And I think, from working with a lot of young people on my end of the spectrum, there is a sense that the church is not being an authentic and reliable witness to the gospel. Our walk doesn't match our talk, and the racial nature of the church reflects that. So we are a church in the United States that is 92% white, and 8% people of color nationally, while our US population is about 40% people of color and growing every day. there was one point in Methodist history, I'm not as familiar with EUB history, where 25% of our membership were people of color. A lot of African Americans, because people liked our message, the Wesleyan message of faith and works and grace and building community together, and that people loved that. But our walk has not matched our talk. So I think if we woke up tomorrow an anti-racist church, we would begin to see a greater influx of people of all colors coming, looking for the Jesus that we celebrate, the God that we
Mm.
serve, who affirms and loves us in all our textures and colors. I think they would want to be a part of the mission and ministry that we espouse, the communities that we say we want. Um, and so that's one thing I think, the church in the United States would look very differently. And around the world, there might be more equal sharing of resources for our churches in Africa and the Philippines and Europe. Um, so I think that's one thing that we would look different. And, I'm an old dog. I'll just say this: we would have more young people at the helm. The average age in our pews is like 60 years old. And shout out to my generation. I'm glad to still be on this side of glory. But I have been in many churches where the youngest person is 55 years old. And there's nothing wrong with us older adults, but we want the church of Christ to endure. It shouldn't end with us. And I think that there are a lot of young people who are looking for guidance from a church that is sure about who we are, whose we are, and what we're for. And I think struggling with racism, we're not demonstrating to God's people what we're really about. Our walk would match our talk if we did.
Thank you, Garlinda. That paints a clear picture. Jordan, our Generation Z, how might you respond to that question? How will anti-racism work grow with your multiracial and multicultural generation?
I think one thing that is good to see in our generation is that anti-racism and I think anti-discrimination more broadly is really at the forefront of what people are thinking and talking about. And I might be a little biased. I am a college student right now, and I do go to CU Boulder, so I recognize that I'm kind of a bit in kind of an echo chamber, I think, in talking about that. But from what I can see from my friends and the people I follow on social media, is that people are kind of aware of two things I think that are really challenging to doing really thoughtful anti-racist work. And the first is just that because of social media, it's really easy to be superficially anti-racist and to be superficially a part of the conversation, but that does not translate into social change. Social change is something that requires a lot of time and energy that I think we are young enough that we are kind of just on the front end of that, hopefully, but that it's I think having that layer of social media can sometimes sort of obscure that. And while I think it's a really powerful way to share information, it's difficult, I think, sometimes to move beyond social media and move beyond the sharing of information and translating that work into action. And so I think anti racism, kind of on a bigger scale, is going to have a really intentional focus on lasting impacts and community engagement. And so, kind of moving beyond the self and moving beyond the process of learning and thinking, how can I engage within my community, right? And that could be like a digital community, I think, but also just thinking about the city that you live in or the state you live in, or maybe even the United States. Um, and I think another thing that I've seen that will be able to come out of my generation, and I think that we're even starting to see kind of in the workforce now, are jobs and fields that are completely dedicated to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So
Nice.
a lot of businesses have, chief diversity officers and people who are doing that work kind of on like a larger institutional scale within different workplaces. But then there's also a lot of social scientists who are studying different ways that we can make spaces more inclusive. And so I think that for a lot of people in my generation who want to do more change, that there's a really big opportunity to make that like a true lifestyle choice to kind of, I think kind of blending like activism with kind of what we think of as traditional work and being able to really like kind of like live and breathe in that space. And that I think in an anti-racist world and maybe in a world going beyond that, that's like anti-discrimination of everybody, that kind of work starts to become more a part of everyday life. And so it doesn't, need to be that we're going to a protest every day, but it's kind of what are the little things we can do in our daily lives that kind of like work towards that goal, and then making that like intentional and lifelong lasting.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jordan. Ken.
I'm going to timestamp this broadcast a bit tonight, Janet. So we're recording on a night where on social media it just blew up with some disclosures from the royal family. The story about racism that confronted Harry and Meghan. And again, it's taking people aback. They're hearing these stories about a young, loving couple having to deal with racism. And I think for us as a country, as a world, we cannot forget there's an urgency about this moment. There's an urgency about dealing with racial injustice. So, my vision is that as faith leaders, and for folks that are listening, more than likely you have a pastor. If you don't have one, Garlinda is plugging the Methodist church so that you will find a Methodist pastor. But here's the deal with pastors, and thank you, Garlinda. We need all the evangelism we can find. As pastors, you need to participate in this work. It's not okay to have a committee just work on the work in the basement or in the annex. You have to show your face. You have to be present because your spiritual office is so incredibly strong. So you have to show up. You have to preach it from the pulpit, not every week, every quarter or so. Just create this vision for justice, the type of justice where, we're on the side of the right things that God's doing. Because this conversation about anti-racism, it's about policy change. And for folks that are religious in this conversation, mostly Methodists, your pastor has incredible power. And power, as most of us have learned, it respects two things: what you do for it and what you do with it. So I'm challenging pastors to participate in this work, teach this work, preach this work. It's necessary. And secondly, I'm encouraging us to build authentic allyships. And here's the image I have in mind. I got some really good friends, Jordan, that happen to be Jewish. And it's one of those practices where I'm learning about someone else's culture and their religion. And for most of my ministry and most of my life, I only thought that when the people of God crossed the Red Sea, it was just people that were formerly slaves becoming free. Hebrew people, the Israelites that crossed the Red Sea under the leadership of Moses. And what my Jewish friends have taught me is that in addition to the slaves crossing the Red Sea, there were Egyptians, people that were born in Egypt, that were Egyptians, that joined the newly freed slaves because they connected with this body of people that aspire for a different life.
Yeah.
And I think what we forget sometimes is we have to engage our bodies. We have to cross over these seas of opportunity that allow us to come together and really be the type of global community that insists that we can eradicate racism. But we have to do this in community. We have to cross this sea of opportunity together, have to be inspired by our faith, because like today, like this recording is coming in the wake of another light that's being shed on global racism. The royal family, of all families that we hold dear for their iconic place in history, and aspirational. And I'm not bashing the family. I'm just simply saying injustice still persists. And we have an opportunity. We have opportunity now in the same way that we had an opportunity when George Floyd was murdered to respond. And we have to keep some energy and focus on challenging each other and continuing to learn and grow and show up together. So I believe that as we think about what this future looks like, it's an opportunity for us to create it. I don't know what it looks like, Janet, but I've got a sense that the people that are listening to this broadcast, they care and they want to be a part of this future we're imagining together.
Thank you, Ken, and I appreciate your word about the urgency of this vision moving forward. I had a friend say just the other day about what do we do with this great reservoir of fear? And how do we empty this reservoir of fear that is holding us back to making the vision real? And I have heard each one of you say that there's power in community, that there's power in working together in your places and your spaces. I want to invite an engagement break. Do we have some comments? I want to know who's here and who is going to respond. Who's got a thought or a comment?
Yeah, let's give some love. Let's read this one off, just as a comment.
Thank you. Audrey says, thank you for clarifying the difference between being a friend and an ally. Good comment, Audrey. Thank you. And then Pastor Liza, Garlinda, I love the invitation to practice interruption skills through role playing. Important. Yes, Liza, I practiced that myself. And it gives you real courage that the words can just come right out of your mouth. And we have a question coming up. This is our question time. Let's see, from Chris. Chris, good to hear you tonight. Chris Marvel, I continue to think of the connection of power and racism. How can we change the structure of the local, state, and nation to help alleviate this? The connection between power and racism, and how can we change local, state, and national structures? Who wants to start on that one?
I'll try.
Garlinda, go.
I'll try. Yeah, because I've been working with the Freedom School movement, the Children's Defense Fund Freedom Schools, to increase literacy among Black and Brown children, particularly children who live in poverty. And so there are some things in the church that I can use as a for instance. In the church, one of our bishops recently found out that a church that had closed and the building that was left had a cornerstone in it, and in the cornerstone from the 20s and 30s were pictures of the church pastor in Klan robes. There was Ku Klux Klan paraphernalia in a United Methodist church and not in the South. And what that bishop did immediately was, first of all, to call it out in a very forthright way that this had been a part of our history. But more than that, he used the proceeds from that church, from the sale of that building, to start an anti racism fund to support ministries of presence that are doing anti racism, not just where we talk about racism, but he created a fund for that specific work in the conference. And he is also committed to having that as a permanent line item in the fund. So this is not just a one-time fund from a one-time sale. His assertion was that we need, this is in our DNA in our church, in this community, and we need to be as deliberate about addressing it, talking about it, confronting it, naming it, as we have been in the past about shielding it. So that was an institutional example. I think churches and other entities of any church have an opportunity to change one's budget to reflect the values of that church. If anti-racism is a real value, then new bulletin covers need to happen, new programs of partnership need to happen in the community. I suggest that, particularly for a white church, that they find an organization, another church of color, whatever, and tithe to that church, to the ministry of that church, to the community organization that is doing anti-racism, to make a tangible financial commitment. So budgets is one way. It's, put it in the budget, that anti-racism is in the budget, and not just, a small budget, but how important is it to have talking groups to support something like what Jordan's doing? I don't know what her group needs, but, do they need money? Do they need equipment? Do they need, what do they, to support that work, and ask the students what they need, what Ken may need in his church. So budget is one. The second thing is presence. Um, One thing that did catch on for many people last year with the killing of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, the others, is that you saw more, not as many as we needed, but more church people talking to police officers, uh, forming citizens groups, supporting citizens group, supporting police officers in, learning skills of anti-racism, to talk to look at the statistics of what's going on with police harassment of people of color, if that is happening in the community, and also helping children and families, of low income communities, particularly those of people of color, by partnering to start programs to keep kids out of the juvenile justice system and keep them focused, on success in school. So you're working at it on both ends. So the other thing would be that people of faith need to be in the public conversation, at city council meetings, at a school board meeting, at a meeting on campus. The United Methodist Women know how to get involved, writing letters to Congress people, and also pressuring our own judicatories in our church to have our budgets become more in line with our values. And part of that is, as you talked about earlier, challenging the spirit of fear. We have been operating with for so many years, with a mindset of scarcity. We're the richest nation in the world, and the United Methodist Church is one of the most wealthy denominations in the United States. And so we act like we don't have anything. We have more than so many people. Mary McLeod Bethune started a school with 4 girls and a couple of bucks. And we got to have that kind of faith and get out there. If it's urgent that we redeem ourselves and be in love and charity and justice with our neighbor, we got to put some bucks behind it and some structure. So those would be two things: money and boots on the ground, in
Thank you,
wherever
Garlinda.
one can fit. Everybody can't go to city council, but everybody can tutor a kid. So
Ken or Jordan, any comments to that?
Jordan, you want to go first?
Yes, I think that that was incredibly well said, Garlinda.
you're so sweet.
I I think I guess I kind of really I feel like I'm going to repeat a lot of points here. Something that I know that I've sort of talked about with sort of like in my classes right now and thinking about how social change works is one of the big ones is redistribution of wealth. And so I think that that aspect of money and budgeting, as difficult I think as it can be to talk about that, is really important. And so I think somewhat knowing my audience, like Highlands Ranch is a fairly wealthy part of the state. And so knowing that there's ways that you as an individual, but then also perhaps like the institutions that you are a part of can be a part of redistributing wealth and resources to communities that have lacked access to those communities and resources. I think that can be a really powerful avenue for creating more lasting change. And Garland spoke to this kind of as well, but I think policy measures and staying involved, especially in your local communities, it's really powerful how much influence you can have by attending city council meetings and getting to know your local representatives and writing to them. I know that I have a friend who's interning for one of our state reps, and she says that it really does have a really big impact when people reach out. She's the one kind of like fielding all the emails, and she says that really does affect what's happening in the office. And so I think really staying involved in local policy is a pretty powerful way, and a relatively easy way in terms of it's making a lot of emails and phone calls, to try to have a more like systemic impact, because that can be kind of a difficult step to bridge.
Jordan,
Absolutely.
that's
Well, I'm glad-
helpful to know. Ken, go ahead. That's helpful to know. I was going to say that our representatives do listen when we write.
They do. Mm-hmm.
Ken,
Yeah, they
Yes.
do. They do. Well, I'm glad that Jordan is highlighting policymakers, because when I heard the question and read the question, my mind immediately went to voting. As Christians, we have to vote our theology. And it should be problematic to all of us that in this historic election for who's now president of the United States, there was a certain segment of the Christian church that had policies that would be deplorable to Jesus. So as we're thinking about ways that we want to do anti-racism work, you have to have in public office people to share a vision for the types of policies that elevate people, that don't marginalize people, that call law enforcement to higher standards of care in communities, and really exercise your vote as a theology. And again, I think this is one of those opportunities we have as a church, not to separate our religion from the state, but utilize our voting power, our awareness of policy to really make a difference. And again, when I heard this comment and this question, my mind went immediately to what we're hearing in the press today about voter suppression. And as Christians, there's a witness that we can have to oppose voter suppression so that we can elect into office persons that care about policies that deal with topics like anti-racism. So my encouragement is for all of us to vote your theology, and just make sure your theology has some semblance of following Jesus. That's all I'm gonna preach about tonight, Janet.
that's okay, preacher. Thank you. And I want to thank Chris for a rich question. How to really engage systemic change. All right, in about 15 minutes, we're going to come to our final question and answer section. So get your questions in. Remember, our panelists will respond to your questions throughout the next week, even if we don't get to them during our broadcast. As we move to our third question, our final question, my observation is that many caring white people have begun to see what people of color have known for a long time about systemic racism, and they want to learn how to become an ally, not a bystander. We're learning that ally is a verb. It's not an identity, but a practice. It's not a destination, but a journey of showing up. And so I want you three to coach us. Coach us. Tell us what we need to know in order to be. Let me ask the question here. How would you coach our actions so that persons of color would actually see us as effective allies? Coach us so that persons of color would actually see us as effective allies. Jordan.
Yes, kick us off. I think a lot of the work that I do has to do with stereotypes. And so stereotypes are born in a place of ignorance and fear and kind of like a lack of knowledge. And when those feelings go uninterrupted, that's when they become solidified. They become institutionalized. They become part of our culture, and then they become much more difficult to break. And so I think as allies, the biggest thing to do is to work to challenge stereotypes on a personal level and on a community level and in whatever institutions that you are a part of, and then also work to reconcile the negative work that they have done. It's kind of like a a two-step process of building awareness about the problems that exist, but then also working to do the healing and kind of the um, repatriation work of the negatives that have kind of come from that. And in thinking kind of along the lines of businesses and Asian American businesses, just sort of what I've been thinking about, the thing that we say is to diversify your consumption, right? This doesn't just go for, Asian businesses and just all businesses and restaurants owned by people of color. Diversify the things you're consuming, right? Whether that's the things that you're purchasing, the movies that you're watching. Raya the Last Dragon just came out on Disney Plus, so I'm gonna watch that this weekend with my roommates. Very excited about that. But really just trying to think really intentionally about everything in your life that you interact with and think, is there a way that I can diversify this? And I think this is a really powerful form of allyship, because when we think about consuming things like food or buying things from businesses and like small businesses like that, that's a really direct, you're supporting someone economically and you're supporting a business of color economically, right? Kind of in the context that we're talking about. But the other thing it does is, if your friends see you eating out at restaurants that serve like non-traditional American cuisine, kind of like ethnic sort of cuisines, um, that kind of creates like a critical mass of people that are willing to like try new things, and it kind of helps break down that barrier of fear and that barrier of knowledge, which I think is really powerful. And that kind of creating a critical mass of a lot of individuals who are kind of in this conversation together is what helps create the momentum necessary for like the bigger institutional change. And so I think allyship definitely is kind of a ground up approach in the way that I see it, and it's really important to be like kind of like loud and proud about it, because I think that's how you get other people to also become effective
Yes.
allies.
Yes.
Oh, diversify your
Yes.
consumption and be loud and proud about it. Oh,
Loud and
thank you,
proud.
Jordan.
Love it. Love it.
Thank you. That's going to travel a long ways tonight. Diversify your consumption and be loud and proud about it. Wonderful. Ken.
Well, I'm glad Jordan mentioned that, because if you go back to this speech, the I Have a Dream speech, Normalcy, Never Again, the first 2 pages or so, Dr. King talks about a vision for economic empowerment. And so it's so important as we're thinking about options for making a difference, to coach people to pay attention to ways that economically they can make a difference. So here's one for folks in Colorado. Sometimes I hear that employers in Colorado would love to have a more diverse workforce, but there isn't a substantial pool of Black folks to hire from. Well, now that we work remotely and we have these global economies, we can actually hire people from different parts of the country. And so I have a friend who is a business owner, CEO of his company, and this is what he's been able to do in white Colorado, so to speak. He's been able to reach beyond the state and hire people of color in different parts of the country to be a part of his company. So I want to encourage you in that space to think creatively with theology as well as technology to reach people in different parts of the country to hire. And specifically for churches, I would encourage you as a church to think about hiring people of color to be at your church. And one of the most visible places you can do this, and this is something we've done at Trinity, and for the sake of people that are listening, this is a mostly white church. We've been able to hire some incredibly gifted Black worship leaders. And I highlight the word worship leaders because they're more than singers or entertainers. They're actually leading this community in a new expression of faith, new expressions of music, new expressions of community. But at the beginning, it started with us hiring. We didn't have the Black folks to volunteer to sing here, but we were able to hire some incredibly gifted worship leaders to help us. And that may be a space for some of us, especially our churches, to think about how we can diversify, include people in our leadership, who's up front, and allowing those persons to be of color. And again, economic empowerment allows the persons, as Gerlinda said earlier, to put it in your budget, that this is a new initiative, a new way of thinking about your music, your worship, but it's a great opportunity to create that space of economic empowerment, especially in the art world where artists, as you know, because of the pandemic, have been sidelined. They're not doing as many live performances. But as we get on the other side of COVID-19, church will always need someone in leadership or worship. And the people you have up front, it's a statement. It tells people what you value, a value of community, inclusion. And again, even for folks of Asian descent or Latinx communities, just being able to have in your worship life people that you hire that can be a part of that leadership will be an incredible way to, again, start modeling what it looks like to be an inclusive community.
I think that's one of the things that when I first visited with you about We Cannot Walk Alone, Ken, you said you talked about the diversifying your sacred space. And so we're diversifying our consumption, diversifying our sacred space, and what all that says. Garlinda.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to take a different tack and talk about the self work that the white family can do to build your muscle for dealing with anti-racism. Um, and it comes from a place it starts with coming from a place of knowledge and strength, as Jordan and Ken have said, and not guilt. I talk about what happened with the church in the north that had the Klan thing. What has grown from that, though, is that the region, the churches in that region are talking about how institutional racism has infected the institution and how to clean up the infection, and learning about the history in a way that makes it impossible to deny that racism is a thing, but it also empowers the whole church community. So we're talking about people of all colors to have a common understanding of the harm that racism can bring and what happens when we free ourselves of it. So, one thing that a congregation or a business or a campus ministry can do to begin is something that I've learned about recently called mapping prejudice. And I've talked about this before, but there are a couple of universities. University of Minnesota is one where they are actually helping businesses, churches, schools to do some racial history on the land on which they sit. And I know that in your area, there's been some conversation for several years about the Sand Creek Massacre and what that has meant to the community. I don't know how much fruit it has borne beyond that, but it was an excellent start. So, um, what has happened is with this project through the university, I know of one Unitarian church in Minnesota that bought some land on which to build their new church. And in looking at the old deed, they found out that the deed from the 40s stipulated that the land should not be sold to anyone but people of the Caucasian race. And that was how it read, Caucasian. And even though that has not been enforced for several years, the fact of the matter is that community is very white. Now it's Minneapolis, but Minneapolis is kind of diverse. But there was a history to why that community remained so segregated, in fact, if not legally. And so that church actually, the Unitarian Church, which is a white church, actually publicly uh, hired a lawyer and got that deed changed before they would build on it. They did not want that to be their legacy. So their legacy is, we broke this pattern of just silently assenting to racism. It was very empowering for them. And so I think one of the ways to help us to understand implicit and explicit bias and the systemic nature of racism is to do some research about our buildings, our property, the property that we own. Where do we build? And the other thing is, as I said before, one way the other thing is with that knowledge, from a systemic place, also personal knowledge is very important. And one of the resources that I actually created called "You Are Here." It's a very basic beginner course on racism. I invite every participant in the small group to do their own racial history, not just
Mm.
about their heritage, but in growing up, how many people of different races were actually in your family? Who was in your parents' inner circle that was of a racial or language group other than your own? Did you ever hear racial slurs or stereotypes spoken by your parents? And I describe what that is, and doing some mapping about. And on the other hand, did your parents ever have a conversation with you about the reality of racial difference and tell you that that is not who we are as Christians? This is not where we're going to be. We as Christians do not use racial slurs. We understand that all people are created in the image of God. And from there to begin to understand what equipment we either got or didn't get in our upbringing in our churches. So I also would say, along with mapping the prejudice in your community, mapping the prejudice in your own home and your own church, and then discuss it and talk about ways to begin to climb out of it. So don't do a book study unless you have an action plan. A book study alone is not going to cure racism, but a book study can be a good jumping off point.
Well, Garland, I'm glad you mentioned knowing your history. That's something that happened at Trinity over the past 2 years. Our church
Great.
came together as a community in like 1859. And as we were
Oh,
doing some
wow.
research, we realized, I mean, yeah, 1859, Lincoln wasn't in office in 1859, right? But we did some research and we learned that at the table of the leadership that created Trinity in 1859 was a former slave. She had purchased, I believe, her own freedom. She was a successful businesswoman. Her name is
Wow.
Clara Brown. So in
Mm-hmm.
1859, when this community was coming together, there was a Black woman at the table with a half a dozen to seven other whites. And so
Mm-hmm.
what the story we have at Trinity now is it's in our DNA to
Right.
be cross-racial.
Right.
We were birthed out of cross-racial realities.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Mm-hmm.
think for most of our communities, we can learn our stories. And as you said, we can learn about our buildings, but we can also learn about our people. And that's what I would
Yes.
encourage, like you're saying, learn your history, learn your story, because when we learn that fact, it just helped us as a faith community just reflect on how do we journey back to who we were in the beginning. We were cross-racial in the beginning. We can
Yes.
strive to be cross-racial in the future.
Yes. Yes. Wonderful.
And I want to thank you for affirming not only the stories of your land and the stories of your congregation, but the personal family stories, the history of racism.
Mm-hmm.
That is very empowering to know your own story and then move into community and hear
Mm-hmm.
congregational story and place. The church that's hosting tonight, St. Luke's. When I became a pastor there years ago, I did research on the indigenous tribes that claimed that land and thought, oh, this we need to honor. We need to honor who we have come from.
Yes.
Thank you very much. We're entering into a last time of question and answer. And an engagement break. Melinda says, thank you, Jordan, Ken, and Garlinda, for your willingness and courage as you pioneer us all as a global community. Thank you, Melinda. And Mike says, this is amazing. So glad we could join this. Thank you, Mike, and your family. I'm looking for any other engagement. If not, we can go on to some questions. Yeah, all right. This is our last time of question. And again, remember that our panelists will respond. Jolie has a question. Many people see faith institutions as built upon racism, bigotry, and intolerance. Unfortunately, there is a lot of truth to this. How do we as a faith community make bold moves towards justice?
Wow.
Thank you, Jolie.
Mhm.
All right. Who's moving forward with this? Ken, you want to start?
I will. Thanks for the question. This is a bold move right now for the community at St. Luke's, and I know where you're located. There's probably a handful of Black folks living within 2 miles of your church. But recognizing that just because you don't have Black folks in your immediate community doesn't mean that you should not care about rehumanizing people, because this
Mm.
movement that we're in right now with racial justice, fighting injustice, is about rehumanizing. And so I want to commend St. Luke's for doing this type of work. And hopefully it'll be a challenge to other churches to create these kind of forums. We have one at Trinity called Anti-Racism Allyship Group. And every Monday night since the murder of George Floyd, we gather in a Zoom meeting and we just stay at this work. And now it's nearly 9 months since his murder that we've been meeting. We feel like we're creating a witness of a different type of church, because you're absolutely right. There is a history of racism and bigotry of the church. We have to confess it, and then we have to repent and go in a new direction. And a part of that is doing creative work like the work that St. Luke's is doing tonight with this broadcast. So hats off to the folks at St. Luke's for creating this vision and this different witness.
Thank you, Ken. Ken.
Wonderful.
Jordan, any response about bold moves? You grew up in St. Luke's.
Yes. I think, and I've talked about this with my roommates as well. We've talked especially about homophobia, and that's kind of the role of homophobia in Christianity and trying to reconcile some of these different ideas. But I think one of the biggest things that I learned at St. Luke's is that um, I think God and spirituality has a lot to do with community, and it also has a lot to do with compassion. And so I think that it's it's a matter of both recognizing the history and the past that the church has had in kind of sustaining and playing out in some of these, in the bigotry and racism that was mentioned in the question, but then also kind of moving forward and taking that into a place and realizing that we can live out the message of spirituality and of God in a more compassionate and loving way, and that there definitely are ways to reconcile these ideas. um, yes, I think.
Thank you, Jordan.
Yeah.
Great answer.
Yes, great answer. Garlinda, would you like to respond to this one about bold moves?
Sure. Oh, yeah. And I did want to say one thing as I go into bold moves. I think it's important for my white family to understand and to embrace the idea that anti-racism work is not something that people of color do, or that's something that white people do for people of color.
Mm.
It is something that redeems us all. And so it is white people's work as well as people of color work, and the facing of racism in this country is primarily the work of our white friends and allies. So I think one bold move would be to 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 do some sort of study about the history of your own community, your own group, your own church, your own campus group, and maybe invite, as a part of what Ken was talking about, a truth and reconciliation process with people of color in your community. If you will remember, this happened in South Africa when apartheid was ending. There were people who wanted to tell their story, and people of color are often not listened to as the wisest persons in the room. And even when we're talking about racism, many times one of the challenges of being an ally is there is sometimes is a tendency for white people to feel that they have to be the experts on everything. And it's difficult to listen to sometimes the stories of people of color and just trust that they're true. It's always, is that really racist? Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe you're looking at it the wrong way, instead of this radical notion of having conversations and reconciliation conversations with people of color, where our stories are believed and affirmed and noted, as springboards for change. And so one of the brave things is to try to form relationships with humility with people of color and listen for a long time before one even gets involved. Just for an example, if I go to if I go to a Latino church, for example, my Spanish is pretty good, but not great. But I'm not steeped in that culture, and so if I'm really trying to understand and form partnership in that culture, I got to go to the church for a while and just say hi to people and listen to the theology spoken from that perspective, from the perspective of, say, a church on the border where there's a mix of immigrant community and recent citizens, or multi generations, and go there in humility, not offering all of my experience that I have none about being an immigrant. And so that's the same kind of thing. A bold move would be to start and slow grow a relationship that builds trust and truth telling over time. Yeah, and know that many people of colors have survived by not trusting all the time the motives of our white brothers and sisters, because from the time Native American land was taken, it's been saying one thing and doing another. So as in any relationship, building trust over time and showing oneself to be an honorable and authentic partner. But I think that's what God calls us to do, with racism, with sexism, with other kinds of relationships, that we're called to be an authentic, humble, and honorable partnership, and to acknowledge and to celebrate the dignity of those that we might otherwise other. And so that would be my call, is to, even on an individual basis, if you've never talked to that Korean American sister at work, you may want to just check her out. And if she's willing to check you out, y'all might become friends and have a real relationship. But I think we can do that at an individual level, on an organizational level, and even a communal level.
Darlinda, that's one of the things that I think I have written down so many times after listening to you and learning from you, is build trust over time. My learning has been so steep during COVID because we had time and we could observe and so forth. And then someone said, Janet, this is going to take you the next decade at least. Ah, slow down, build some trust over time.
Yeah, it's a
Yes,
relationship. It's
it
not a
is a
sprint.
relationship and a friendship, as Ken
Yes.
began.
And
Uh,
there's urgency in transforming the systems, but relationships take longer. And so we do both and.
both the interpersonal relationships and the systemic change at the same time.
Right.
My goodness, my friends, we are nearing the end of our time together, and I want to thank you for educating this white sister tonight. Thank you so much for allowing me to moderate this conversation. I want to thank the Center for Spiritual Engagement for calling us all together. Now, I've asked for you if you would each give us a call to action, about 20 or 30 seconds to just tell us, let's go forth and. All right? This is going to be in the church. We'd say this is the going out the door benediction. So let's see. Let's put Ken in the middle. So I'm gonna let Jordan. Will you start?
Yes, I can. And I think the big takeaway that I want to leave people with tonight is that it's really important as an ally and as someone who's working on this to make connections. I think we kind of ended on this note of building community and building trust, and that conversations and trust and using that to build a critical mass is really, really essential for social change. And I encourage everybody to look for the ways in your life that this is applicable to you. Kind of take it, think about the things in life that you take for granted that other people may not have access to, and do what you can to share your resources and share your time and share your compassion.
Thank you, dear friend. Ken.
I mean, my challenge to everyone is to engage your body. Just ask that question on a regular basis. How am I showing up? Which is more than processing things in your mind. It's more than the very productive groups that we have via Zoom or the book clubs we used to enjoy in person. But actually asking the question, where is your body showing up? And who is next to you when you show up in these spaces? Because my sense is in order to deal with this challenge of racism in America, we have to conquer the notion that proximity divides us. And when we can reduce the distance between us, which physically means our bodies need to be in closer proximity, there's this opportunity to really see something precious about another human being. So my challenge for all of you is to remember that that word sacrifice, its original origin in Latin meant to make something holy, to make it sacred. And as you think about where your body shows up, it's going to mean a sacrifice of time, a sacrifice of distance to travel, but it's a sacrifice that God will continue to honor as we rehumanize people that are created in the same image of God that we are.
Oh, thank you, dear colleague. Thank you.
Yes, yes.
Garlinda, bring us home.
I will say that the same God that took Saul and knocked him over and made him Paul can lead us to dismantle racism. So my challenge is that we listen to God's voice, that we listen, that we learn, that we change our behavior to behave anti-racist, and we will become anti-racist. I believe that.
Behave to
Amen.
become. Thank you. Thank you, dear friend. Well, I want to thank Ken and Jordan and Garlinda and all of your networks for bringing you to this space. In studio, my thanks to Danny, Sally, and Julie. Thanks to the CSE team and Brave Spaces for your passion to change the world. At St. Luke's, thanks to Reverend Michelle and Pastor Liza. Thanks to the Mountain Sky Conference of the United Methodist Church, especially Reverend Betty Wynn and Bishop Karen. And thank you, dear participants, for your engagement with us tonight. Blessings and good night.